What is this? Who is behind it? Why are we seeing it now? And when will it actually release? Let's deep dive the Emio mystery that has Nintendo fans' pulses racing. I'll give some fast food background for those who haven't followed the recent news, although there are numerous great videos around giving fuller details. Essentially though, Nintendo have dropped a tiny teaser trailer asking who is Emio, featuring this creepy paper bag wearing character. We know the Emio name roughly translates to Smiling Man, and we know that this is a mature game that appears to be published by Nintendo. Sleuths have also noticed that the Polish horror developers Bloober have alluded to some kind of work for Nintendo consoles and them needing to focus on quality as the result of this. This has led to the conclusion that this could be a development by the Bloober Team. Additionally, the Australian ratings board has given hints at various dark and disturbing themes, which I won't spoil and potentially shouldn't anger the gods of YouTube by even discussing. Instead, let me get on the good side of the YouTube's corporate overlords by suggesting that you Google it. Okay, where to start? There are lots of things to unpick here. Issues around the potential development team, and of course, particularly Bloober Team if they're involved. Issues around Nintendo's own potential involvement and their history with titles of this nature, plus the potential release schedule. So let's start with the broadest perspective, Nintendo and horror. And yes, this is relatively unusual for the big N, particularly in recent years, but Nintendo and horror is far from an unprecedented combination. It is certainly true that in the Switch era they have been quite horror averse, with no original first-party horror entries, and even the recent Fatal Frame re-release being released by Koei Tecmo rather than under the Nintendo label as happened previously. But Nintendo does have a history of dipping their toe, infrequently but occasionally, into the horror genre, whether very explicitly, as with Eternal Darkness, Zombie U, or the Fatal Frame series, or in more subtle ways, going back to the Famicom Detective Club story The Girl Who Stands Behind, which is not a flat-out horror, but certainly contains some incredibly sinister imagery and shocking twists. I do think the timing works well for Nintendo. The Switch has a huge install base and is in a relatively light period for first-party titles, so it makes sense to launch something new now. Equally, Nintendo need to send the signal to other game developers that their consoles, and particularly their shiny new console that's coming over the hill, are a natural fit for more varied titles than classic Nintendo fare, great though the Luigi's Mansions of this world no doubt are. I think it's actually very beneficial for Nintendo to be able to point to a relatively high-profile case of them promoting a different genre than people might expect of them. Remember that Nintendo has an aspiration to bring gaming to people who are not usual players, and while that ambition usually makes people think of bringing grannies into gaming through Wii Sports, or perhaps increasing the number of women playing games through successes like Animal Crossing, horror is a discrete niche with a significant history in Japan and a dedicated fan base. Yes, it might be a relatively small market, but it still represents a new toehold for Nintendo if they can find a way to interpolate themselves into that market space. And the timing also seems propitious. Although the middle of summer may not feel like an ideal time for horror to a Western mindset, in the sticky, humid Japanese July and August, the Festival of Obon is just around the corner. The Obon Festival is the annual Buddhist event where it is believed that the spirits of deceased ancestors return to the world to visit. People in Japan often visit graves, float lanterns in rivers, or hang them in front of houses. The atmosphere of this is clearly conducive to ghost stories, and Japan famously has a grand horror tradition, particularly in the depths of summer. This event is a public holiday in Japan, and given its spooky connotations, would, under normal circumstances, be an ideal time to release a horror game. Whether they would release it on the holiday, which falls from the 13th to the 16th of August this year, or just before, I'm not sure, but it definitely feels like it could be a good moment to at least run a promotion campaign. And it's not like Nintendo is starting from zero. Luigi's Mansion 2 HD may seem like a million miles away from a creepy, mature-rated title, but if Nintendo are placing their counters on the board of getting attention for their horror games, there is an elegant synchronicity, a horror game for the children and something with a bit more grit for the adults, both releasing within the summer window. Based on this, I would say that there is a 30% chance that the game will drop before the end of August. There is a reason that I'm keeping that score low, and that's because Nintendo traditionally does not release games in this period. It's true that 2019's Astral Chain did release at the end of August, and it's also true that Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle was also a release in this period, but the latter game was put out by Ubisoft, and 2019's Astral Chain was at the beginning of an incredibly packed period of releases for Nintendo and came right at the very end of August. We know from comments from Kit and Krista, among others, that Nintendo often takes quite a long period of time off in August, and this is something that is natural for a lot of Japanese companies where the work schedule is often incredibly intense and the expectation on employees is such that unless the companies actually force people's hand to take time off, they often won't. And so a lot of companies do shut down, particularly around the Festival of Obon. However, it's still completely conceivable that Nintendo would be able to release a game in this period, especially if it were a relatively small title that does not require quite the level of supervision of, say, a Super Mario Party Jamboree. I would not expect it similarly to be a Switch 2 extravaganza. It's true that if the game is released much later than August, it would suggest that there's a much more long-term plan afoot for it, and perhaps it's a bigger deal than we might think. But I would still say there's a 70% chance we're expecting this by the end of 2024 and 90% by the end of the financial year, just looking at how rarely Nintendo does long marketing cycles outside its very biggest game franchises. And even with their biggest titles, Super Mario Wonder shows they're quite happy to keep hype cycles relatively short. So how deeply involved are Nintendo? They have quite an extensive history of publishing other people's horror games, but doing something in-house or even in collaboration would seem like a real departure. However, we know from the recent corporate governance report that Nintendo have confirmed that they are working on original IP, something Shinya Takahashi reiterated in the recent investor statements, and we know they have a large and growing number of young developers. One way that Nintendo often try to introduce these new developers is by giving them a small title of their own. From Jump Rope Challenge to Splatoon and ARMS, we have seen this before, and it does make complete sense to me that a small team of newer Nintendo devs could try to do a Nintendo take on the horror genre, and that Nintendo would therefore give this a little bit more of a push. I think the problem with horror is that by its nature it is reliant on experiences happening to you rather than gameplay that you can act upon, and that's not necessarily very Nintendo. Also, it can have a lot of tropes, and Nintendo like to be seen as doing their own thing. However, it's not the first time that Nintendo have thought about how they might put themselves into the horror genre. If we go back to 2009, Satoru Iwata commented on horror as one potential use of the then new Wii Vitality sensor. He said, "Traditionally, great games have made people excited and stimulated. Wii Vitality sensor has a great potential for various applications like measuring how horrified a player is in a horror title. With the Switch's IR application already being used for heartbeat monitoring in Ring Fit Adventure, you have to wonder if the team behind the tech have long had a notion of using this kind of technology to monitor how scary a game could be. I'm not saying this will be part of the game, but as a side note, if it is part of the game, there is a thought-provoking consequence of this." Again, referring back to Kit and Krista, who've mentioned many times, including in their most recent podcast, about the sheer amount of data Nintendo collects behind the scenes, and having people's literal pulse rate in response to a scary game could be a particularly rich seam of data for Nintendo's team to explore if they wanted to move more fully into the horror world at some point in the future. Nintendo sometimes does dip their toes into ideas quite gradually. The Labo kits seem to be experiments into the world of VR, for example. So if there is evidence of heavy involvement from Nintendo's core developers, it might be an interesting glimpse into their direction of thought. Still, you have to consider the overall likelihoods. Nintendo rarely creates new IPs, but they do have a habit of publishing smaller titles themselves. In the Switch era, we've had Snipper Clips, The Stretchers, and Good Job as examples of these, all games which involved international collaboration. The Stretchers was an example of a game that was shadow dropped on Nintendo Switch in November 2019, at a time when you'd think their game slate could not be any fuller. That quarter they already had Luigi's Mansion 3, Ring Fit Adventure, Pokemon Sword and Shield, and Mario and Sonic at the Olympics on the slate. The Stretchers dev team Tarsier Studios are based in Malmö in Sweden, and I can find little solid evidence of how this surprise partnership came to be, but the co-creative director of the game is Nintendo's Masamichi Abe, a long-time Nintendo employee, now at EPD, but who previously has worked internationally within Nintendo with Nintendo Software Technology in America, working on Metroid Prime Hunters and some of the Mario vs. Donkey Kong titles, among others. As well as liaising frequently with NST, he has also received credits on Snipper Clips and Good Job, and seems to be at the head of cultivating unusual partnerships with smaller game studios and niche products. It's sometimes a little tricky to identify the origins of these kinds of projects, but clearly Nintendo receives a lot of pitches from smaller studios, and while it's rare for them to bite, sometimes they do. Paladin Studios, the Dutch developers of Good Job, were interviewed by Nintendo Everything in 2020 and explained the origins of the collaboration as being from the studio approaching Nintendo directly. Of particular interest in this interview is producer for Nintendo, Takao Naoko's response, which I will quote. He said, "It's been a long time since we first met Paladin. I think it was one of those game events somewhere. I've played some of their smart device games before, and all of them have a very cheerful atmosphere, and I got the impression that they make their games with great care. Also, I heard that Paladin had experience working with Japanese game publishers previously, so from that standpoint as well, I may have been more interested in Paladin as a game studio." And just to interrupt, of course, we know that Bloober Studios also has recent experience working with Japanese developers because they've been doing the remake for Silent Hill. Back to Naoko-san's comments, he said that since then, we had been looking for an opportunity to work together. In 2017, our Nintendo team had an opportunity to visit Paladin Studios, and at that time, we discussed further about working on a project together. Nintendo requested Paladin to work on an experimental game idea, and from that experimental project, the base of Good Job was born. After discussions between the two companies, we agreed to polish this raw stone into a product, and the full game development started. So although the concept seems to have come from Paladin, it was Nintendo's request that they developed an experimental game idea, so it's a pretty interesting insight into how these kinds of collaborations could come about. Now, it is not necessarily the case that this Emio game is another example of this outreach approach from Nintendo. It could be a Switch 2 juggernaut exclusively developed at EPD, and I don't think it being exclusively developed at Nintendo is impossible at all, given the heavy Japanese aesthetic of the title and its look. This does feel like a game geared around the Japanese audiences primarily, but based on the past trends of these games, another co-development studio partnership does seem more likely, and I'll put that at a 70% likelihood. Now, there are many Japanese studios, I'm sure, who may be able to develop a game like this, but within this overall likelihood, we should probably now consider Bloober Studios. Ordinarily, I would not necessarily say that this developer is particularly likely, as the wording of their statements about a link to Nintendo are actually rather vague. The CEO of the company, Peter Babieno, commented, "Project M, although its budget is significantly smaller than the games we are working on at Bloober Team, is extremely important due to our long-term plans. In addition, we are working on it in cooperation with the world's best game creators for Nintendo platforms, so we cannot afford to create just a decent game." That doesn't actually suggest Nintendo publishing or involvement per se, as the Switch is flush with people developing for it. However, I think the silver bullet here is the timing. Remember that Nintendo likes to surprise its audiences, and the announcement of this news on a Polish language investor website ran the risk of being picked up by Nintendo media. I guess Nintendo have this crazy idea that there are people on YouTube and other places who analyse their every move to death. Crazy, I know, but what you gonna do? Anyway, I don't think they usually like to be bounced into an announcement, and I'm sure, given the proximity to Obon, that the plan was always to be announcing it around this period, but it's quite possible that the Nintendo brass thought it was better to pull the trigger sooner so people would see the tease without any prior expectations around Nintendo doing a horror title or around the specific developers, the profile of particular developers being a topic they seem to be particularly touchy about of late, with their secrecy around the Mario and Luigi Brothership developers coming to mind. Now, Snipperclip's good job on the stretchers were all collaborations with partners in Europe, so working with Bloober Studios does fit this pattern, and I would say there is a 50% chance at this point that the reports are accurate and that Bloober Studios are indeed the minds behind Emio, or at least in close collaboration with Nintendo EPD's own members of staff. I would tend to think the game would have a slightly larger degree of input than other titles of that sort from Japan, just because given the strong Japanese aesthetic that the trailer gives off, it really feels to me like this has become from the brain of somebody at Nintendo. But then again, Bloober have worked on remaking Silent Hill, so getting into the mindset of Japanese horror developers is probably something that they would see as a great strategic move for them. What then is the general release plan for this game? Now, Snipperclips did receive a Victory Lap retail release in 2017, but generally speaking, these types of games are eShop titles which don't have any further life after that. There are also real logistical issues with the retail release, as I understand Nintendo generally needs to give 30 days notice to get the games into retailers, and if they wanted the title on shelves during Obon, that would be tricky to achieve, although not impossible, as the precedent of Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which had a 16-day notice period, proved, and the 30-day window ends conspicuously just before the first day of Obon. If Nintendo are looking to do a retail release on Obon itself, it would be an interesting move, and could really stress test how robust their anti-leak and pro-secrecy measures are on a smaller and relatively inconsequential title that nevertheless has a degree of hype which could attract people trying to find out more and post it all over the web before their much more major project next year of launching a new Nintendo console. Another tick in the box for a potential retail title is that this game feels like it has a real Japanese focus, and the Japanese market is generally much more receptive to retail titles over electronic ones. Still, it's unusual for these kinds of titles to receive retail releases right away. Certainly if the game does well, the likelihood of that trends up, so I would say there's a 50% chance of a retail release by the end of 2025. A couple of other quick things. I have seen comments that potentially Capcom or Konami or other Japanese studios could be involved, and while that is certainly possible, it does seem unlikely to me that a company which traditionally publishes its own titles would want to have Nintendo publish a game like this, even when there have been collaborations with Nintendo before, as with Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. It tends to be the other studios that actually do the publishing work, and Nintendo have given space to Capcom before, with the example of Monster Hunter's Rise, where the title was allowed the plum end of March retail spot to release in. Therefore, I would say that it is only a 10% chance that Capcom or Konami or another major Japanese studio are involved, although of course Koei Tecmo do have history with Nintendo, so I think they might be slightly more likely, although on balance I don't think they are involved in this particular project myself. As we wrap up the video, quick shout out to commenter Minecrafter3448. In the meantime, if you feel some kind of supernatural, ghostly, spectral urge to click on a different video, then well, it looks like there are some on screen. It's uncanny, isn't it? Well, I can only recommend that you fully indulge that video clicking urge, and I will see you soon for another Nintendo Forecast.